On a grey afternoon, in the year 479 BCE, in the quiet city of Lu in eastern China, an old teacher drew his last breath. There was no great trumpet fanfare, no cheering crowds, no royal procession. Confucius, known in his own time as Confucius, died at the age of 73 in relative obscurity, surrounded by a handful of loyal disciples, but lacking the political power or empire that many great figures of history commanded. His life had been marked by wandering between the fractured states of the spring and autumn period, a lifetime spent teaching, debating, and offering his counsel to rulers who rarely heeded it. In his final years, he returned home, teaching modest classes, editing ancient texts, and urging kindness, ritual, and moral integrity. Yet, as he passed away, the world knew him merely as a teacher from a small state, one voice among many in a crowded era of thinkers. But this gentle demise was only the beginning of something far greater. Over the following centuries, his disciples compiled his sayings into what would be known as the Analects, and long after the kingdoms he once knew had vanished, millions upon millions across China, Korea, Japan, and beyond would live according to his words. So we ask, in a whisper fit for the still of night, how did a wandering teacher, rejected by kings and ruling no lands, come to shape the minds of generations, ruling hearts where no throne ever stood? Chapter 1. A World Falling Apart. Imagine, if you will, a world long before Confucius's gentle voice ever shaped thoughts and customs. Over 2,500 years ago, in the vast plains of ancient China. This was not a peaceful world. It was a time when an old order was crumbling, and the ground beneath it was shifting in ways few could yet see. It was the spring and autumn period, a chapter of history defined by the slow collapse of great authority and the relentless rise of competing powers. At the heart of this transformation was the Eastern Zhou dynasty, 770 to 256 BCE. The Zhou dynasty, once a mighty force, had already lost its grip on real power. After the capital fell in turmoil and the king retreated eastward, the Zhou kings remained as symbolic figures, the son of heaven in title, but without the military strength or political influence they once wielded. The real control of the land now rested in the hands of dozens of feudal lords, each ruling their own fief, raising armies, and pursuing their own ambitions. These lords were known as Zhou, the aristocratic rulers of small, often independent states. By the middle of the 6th century BCE, northern China was a patchwork of competing domains: Qi, Jin, Chu, Lu, Jin, and scores of smaller states, each carving out territory and influence, while the old rituals and ceremonies that once bound them together lost their force. Warfare became commonplace, not the pitched battles of legend, but the everyday clashes for land, prestige, and power. Alliances were made and broken like fragile threads. Diplomacy became inseparable from ambition. In this turbulent landscape, the ancient rites and moralities that once gave meaning to leadership were being cast aside. The very foundations of society, ritual, loyalty, and the promise of moral rule were fading from view. Yet amid this chaos, something unexpected began to stir. Far from the grand palaces of struggle and siege, minds turned inward to questions of virtue, loyalty, and order. The old rhythms of life, the ceremonies, the music, the rites, were no longer mere tradition. They became a source of longing, a memory of what society once aspired to be. And so, in a world fatigued by conflict and distrustful of power,
the soil was fertile for ideas that spoke not of conquest or dominance, but of ethical leadership and human goodness. In the midst of political fragmentation, the seeds of moral philosophy began to take root. These seeds would one day sprout into a voice of enduring clarity, though no one yet knew it. Here, in the twilight of an old order, Confucius would soon take his first breaths, and the sound of change, like soft footsteps in a dark forest, was beginning to approach.
Chapter 2. Born without privilege. In the year 551 BCE, in a small settlement called Zhou, within the eastern Chinese state of Lu, a child was born, whose name the world would one day speak quietly, with reverence: Confucius. Later generations would know him as Confucius, a name bestowed centuries later by Western scholars. But those early years were not marked by privilege or pomp. He came into a world already fracturing under the pressures of political ambition and social change. Confucius's father, known as Shu Liang He, was a seasoned warrior and minor official in the Lu state. By the time his son was born, he was already advanced in years. Despite his relative status as a shi, a member of the lower aristocratic class, the family's fortunes were modest, caught between a remembered noble lineage and the hard realities of diminished influence. Tragedy struck early. When Confucius was only about 3 years old, his father died, leaving his young widow to raise their son in increasingly difficult circumstances. With the loss of the family's main provider, the household slipped into poverty, and Confucius's early life was shaped by scarcity rather than comfort. His mother, Yan Zhengzai, worked tirelessly to care for her son, instilling in him the earliest lessons of resilience and duty. In those formative years, the future philosopher would know what it meant to carry the weight of his family's survival. He would learn not only the rituals and music of tradition, skills prized in his society, but also the humbling experience of work that had nothing to do with titles or rank. As he later reflected in the Analects, his lack of wealth and high birth compelled him to become skilled in many menial things, a phrase that reveals both the hardship he endured and the practical foundation upon which his teaching would rest. This early absence of privilege, no towering heritage, no courtly influence, no immediate path to power, left an indelible mark on Confucius. It anchored in him a belief that ethical character should matter more than noble blood, that virtue was earned through effort and reflection rather than inherited by lineage. And in those quiet years of struggle, in a humble home in Lu, the seeds of his later teachings were beginning to take root, rooted not in entitlement, but in the lived experience of rising from obscurity towards something enduring. Chapter 3. The Boy Who Loved Rituals. In the soft light of dawn, long before he was known as a thinker whose name would echo through millennia, Confucius was first a boy, drawn to order and meaning. Born into a world unsettled by conflict and change, he found his earliest solace not in play or idle games, but in the careful patterns of ritual, music, and tradition, what the ancients called Li and Yue. These were far more than formal performances. They were the invisible threads that held society's heart together. In the state of Lu, young Confucius watched with quiet fascination as elders performed rites to honor ancestors, welcomed guests with precise gestures, and played melodies meant to attune the spirit. To his attentive eyes, every movement, every note, seemed to be part of a larger pattern, a harmony between heaven and earth,
between people and their place in the world. These were not empty spectacles. They were the living language of human connection and moral intent. As a child, he would sit near the hearth after supper, listening to elders recount the rhythms of the 6 arts: archery, charioteering, calligraphy, arithmetic, ritual, and music, each one a key to becoming a complete person. Of these, Li and Yue held a special place. Ritual, he learned, was not mere etiquette, but the way a community affirmed its values. Music was not just sound, but a tuning of the heart, inviting balance and harmony where chaos threatened to seep in. In quiet moments, perhaps under a fading sunset or beside a crackling fire, the young boy would arrange small ceremonial objects with meticulous care, practicing again and again the gestures he saw in the great halls. He perfected his posture, his reverent silence, the respectful bow, learning that the true purpose of Li was not performance, but alignment of one's spirit with the rhythm of the world. It was here, in these unobserved labors of the heart, that the foundations of his later teaching were laid, that ritual and music are not rules to obey, but paths toward a cultivated and harmonious life. So imagine this, a young boy, calm and focused, placing ceremonial vessels in perfect order, his eyes learning the language of ancient gesture, his mind slowly understanding that the smallest motion can reflect the greatest intention. In those early years, Confucius was not yet a teacher of kings, but he was already a student of harmony, internal, interpersonal, and universal. And from that quiet beginning would grow an influence that no sword or crown could ever command.
Chapter 4. Learning as a Lifelong Path. As the mists of early morning curled over fields and village paths in the state of Lu, a young Confucius was already awake, eager to learn what the day might teach him. Unlike many boys of his era, he did not see education as a phase that ended when one left childhood. Instead, learning for him was a way of life, a perpetual journey that would later define his purpose and legacy. From the age of 15, Confucius devoted himself to the pursuit of wisdom across a broad range of disciplines: music, history, poetry, rites, and more. He was not content to be shallow or narrow in his understanding. Rather, he believed that true knowledge came from sustained study, reflection, and the courage to recognize what one did not yet know. This belief was the heartbeat of his philosophy, that education was not the exclusive domain of the elite, but a universal path towards self-cultivation and moral clarity. At a time when formal learning was often reserved for the aristocracy, Confucius made a quiet yet radical departure from this tradition. He opened his teachings to any willing student, regardless of birth or fortune. Wealth, he saw, was no prerequisite for worthiness. Effort and sincerity were. In doing so, he helped dismantle the idea that education was a privilege confined to those of noble blood. His classrooms welcomed men of humble means alongside those of higher status, and he taught them all with equal intensity. Confucius often spoke of 学而, to learn and then to practice what one has learned, as a source of joy and purpose. For him, education was not a ticket to power or influence, but a path to becoming a better human being. It was a relentless pursuit, a way of tending one's own mind and character in the hope that others might follow. This belief resonated deeply with his disciples and drew many to travel long distances to hear him speak. In those early days, Confucius might have seemed just another teacher in a world overflowing with competing voices. But his unwavering commitment to lifelong learning would ripple outward through centuries, shaping not only the minds of individuals,
but entire systems of governance, ethics, and education throughout East Asia. And so, under fading lantern light and before the hush of sleep, imagine the young Confucius turning pages of worn scrolls, absorbing each lesson as if his life depended on it. Because, in a way, it did. For he was not merely learning for today, but learning for a world that had yet to know his name.
Chapter 5. The First Private Teacher. In the quiet twilight of the spring and autumn period, when the lives of common people and nobles alike were caught in the ebb and flow of war and uncertainty, something unprecedented began to take shape, not on the battlefield, but in the humble rooms where a single teacher opened his doors to the world. Confucius, now past 30 years of age, stepped into a role that would change the course of education in ancient China. He became the first great private teacher. Before Confucius, formal education was largely confined to the aristocracy. Only the children of powerful families, born into privilege, had access to the rituals, texts, and arts that shaped political and civil life. Others could memorize sayings at home or learn trades from elders, but structured learning was a luxury of rank. Then Confucius did something both simple and radical. He opened his doors to all who wished to learn. His school was not a fortress of wealth or status, but a gathering place for minds eager to grow. Scholars and farmers' sons, men of modest means, and those with dreams greater than their stations, all were welcome. There was no fixed tuition in silver or grain. Students often offered what they could, perhaps a bundle of firewood, a few bushels of grain, or simple service. What Confucius truly valued was not what a student could pay, but what he was willing to give of himself in pursuit of knowledge. In those days, as students came and went beneath the simple eaves of his teaching hall, something extraordinary happened. Confucius did not merely lecture, he engaged. He asked questions that stirred thought, encouraged dialogue that built understanding, and listened with genuine care to the voices of his disciples. His curriculum drew upon the ancient 6 arts: ritual, music, archery, chariot skill, calligraphy, and calculation. But his frame of reference was deeper. Education as a work of character. Word spread quietly, like dappled moonlight through bamboo groves. Men came from distant villages and nearby towns, each seeking wisdom that could not be measured by rank or bloodline. Some stayed for years, others returned home to teach what they had learned. Soon, Confucius's community of learners became more than a school. It was an intellectual fellowship, the earliest circle of thinkers in a world desperate for moral clarity. By breaking the old norms that tied education to aristocracy, Confucius laid the foundation for a tradition of public teaching and lifelong learning. His students were not merely pupils. They were torchbearers of a new way of understanding the world, a way that would spread outward through generations to come. And so, in those early evenings, when the sun set low and shadows grew long, you could find men seated cross-legged on simple mats, listening to their master's gentle voice, learning not for wealth, not for power, but for something far deeper: the art of living well.
Chapter 6. Dreams of Political Reform. As the dust of daily life settled and the glow of twilight spread across the fields of Lu, Confucius dreamed of something more than teaching. In his mind, education was not merely a private journey of moral cultivation. It was a seedbed for political renewal, a way to heal a world fractured by ambition and disorder. In an era when rulers wielded power through force, Confucius believed
that ethical leadership could restore harmony to society. Instead of laws enforced by fear, he imagined governments led by trust, ritual, and virtue, where leaders drew obedience not by threat, but by example. Confucius's first real step toward influencing political life came not in philosophy, but in public office. In his early 50s, after years of teaching and building a devoted circle of students, he gained a modest yet meaningful appointment within the government of his native state. The rulers of Lu named him to several official roles, among them magistrate and later minister of justice, positions that gave him a chance to put his ideas into practice. These roles were not seats of unquestioned power, but they offered a platform, a town to administer, laws to oversee, and opportunities to guide those under his charge toward a more ethical way of living. In these early offices, Confucius began to test his vision of reform. He believed that when leaders embodied the virtues they wished to see in others, ordinary people would follow, not because they were commanded to do so, but because they trusted their leader's sincerity. In his eyes, moral authority was the most powerful force in governance. He encouraged rulers to model righteousness, uphold ritual propriety, and guide their people with humanity rather than harsh punishment. This idea drew directly from his reading of ancient Zhou practice and from the teachings he had labored to impart to his students. At times, Confucius's ideals seemed to bear fruit. Disputes were resolved with fairness, disputes over law and order eased, and officials learned to temper authority with integrity. But the political landscape remained volatile. Powerful aristocratic families in Lu held influence that rivaled, and often overshadowed, that of the nominal ruler. Their interests did not always coincide with Confucius's vision of ethical rule. Though he strove to guide through example and counsel, entrenched power structures resisted change. Still, in those days of early public service, we see the first real attempt to translate lofty ideas into lived political action. Confucius was no longer just a teacher of ethics. He had become a practitioner of reform, testing his philosophy against the unpredictable terrain of human governance. In the glow of lantern light and the hush of evening courtyards, he began to learn the hard truth that changing a society's heart is far easier than changing its politics. But he never abandoned the dream that one day both might be transformed.
Chapter 7. Power Rejects Morality. As Confucius stood beneath a gentle glow of dusk, watching the dust settle after another day in the state of Lu, there was a moment when he must have felt the weight of the world's indifference pressing gently upon his spirit. For all his dreams of moral governance, of leaders guided by virtue instead of fear, the reality of power in his time was proving far more resistant than he had hoped. The very rulers he wished to advise were often unwilling or unable to be bound by the ethics he championed. This was not merely the reluctance of individuals. It was the deep entrenchment of competing families and factions, whose interests outweighed concern for what Confucius saw as the greater good. The spring and autumn era was rife with power struggles. Aristocratic families in Lu, such as the Ji-sun lineage, held influence that rivaled the state's own ducal authority. These powerful clans pursued their ambitions with tenacity, often disregarding ritual norms and moral propriety if those norms interfered with their goals. Confucius, unwavering in his belief that ritual and virtue should guide leadership, found himself increasingly at odds with these forces. Unlike abstract debates in his classroom, here were men whose actions were shaped not by the harmony of Li, but by the rough business of factional advantage. A defining moment came when Confucius's efforts to steer Lu's government back toward ethical governance failed to gain traction. A prolonged struggle with influential families over the rightful balance of power culminated in his forced resignation from office. Instead of being a trusted advisor whose counsel shaped the state's direction, he became someone whom powerful figures simply could not tolerate. The very society he had hoped to renew through virtue had turned away from him, leaving his reforms unfulfilled. This was his first profound encounter with disillusionment, not a minor setback, but a clear recognition that moral authority alone could not compel those who wielded real power to change their course. Confucius's principles remained unshaken in his heart, yet the world of politics showed him that good intentions do not easily bend the arc of entrenched interests or overturn the ambitions of the powerful. With his dreams of reform in lieu thwarted, Confucius made a difficult choice. He stepped away from the corridors of power and embarked on a period of wandering across other states of the Zhou world. For 13 years, he traveled to Wei, Song, Chen, and Kai, seeking leaders who might be open to his vision of virtuous rule, yet so often meeting polite dismissal, misunderstanding, or outright rejection. Throughout these journeys, he remained committed to his ideals, even as his hope of immediate political transformation dimmed. Still, it was in this very moment of profound disappointment, when the path he had walked with such hope seemed blocked, that Confucius began to forge something deeper.
What he could not achieve through political office, he would refine through teaching and the testimony of his own life. Here, in the twilight of his early ambitions, lay the first seeds of a legacy that would outlast kingdoms. And as night settled over the fields of Lu, he walked on, quietly, humbly, unbowed. Chapter 8. 13 Years on the Road. When Confucius left his native state of Lu, it was not with triumph, but with a weighed heart and steady resolve. He was in his mid-50s, an age when most men in his time might have resigned themselves to familiar paths, but for him, the journey was only beginning. What followed would be over a decade of wandering from land to land, a long odyssey in search of a ruler who might listen, who might understand, who might dare to govern by ethics instead of force. This was not a leisurely pilgrimage. It was a vocation sustained by hope, even as the world offered resistance at every turn. Confucius set out first toward the state of Wei, to the west of Lu, accompanied by a small circle of devoted disciples. These were men who had chosen not the ease of home, but the uncertain roads of wandering with a teacher whose ideals were yet unfulfilled in political practice. For 13 years, they would traverse the fractured landscape of the eastern Zhou world, moving from state to state, Wei, Song, Chen, Cai, and even toward the distant borders of Chu, appealing again and again to lords whose interests too often lay elsewhere. In Wei, Confucius waited with patience long enough that even the ruler's attention flagged. When he finally succeeded in gaining an audience, the meeting ended in polite detachment. The Wei ruler admired the teacher's reputation, but did not embrace his counsel. Confucius left quietly, the hope of influence fading, but not extinguished. From Wei, he and his followers traveled southward into Song, where courtly politics were thick with rivalry. In Song, tensions ran high as Confucius sought to present his vision of virtuous governance, rooted in ritual and moral example. But ambition can blind even the most refined mind, and some at court saw his presence not as wisdom, but as a threat to established interests. On more than one occasion, whispers of suspicion trailed him. An attempt on his life was narrowly averted, and he left Song with the unsettled feeling that virtue was still too weak a force in the world of power and prestige.
Even harsher trials followed on the roads between Chen and Cai, where food grew scarce and travel became perilous. At times, the group walked for days without provisions, their strength tested by hunger and exhaustion. The disciples, once confident and eager, became as fragile as the path beneath their feet. Yet through these hardships, Confucius remained composed, tending both body and spirit, reminding those with him that character is not forged in ease, but in adversity. In the distant lands near Chu, the borders stretched wide and unfamiliar. The very terrain seemed to push back against them, rivers swollen, forests thick with silence, and roads so desolate they echoed the uncertainty of their mission. Still, Confucius pressed on. Even when the prospects of persuasion dimmed, he spoke to his disciples about the necessity of staying true to principle, of nurturing the seed of virtue wherever they could plant it. Through kings who listened only politely, lords who admired his manners but not his moral demands, and courtiers who saw him as a quaint relic of an age that had passed, Confucius endured. He did not find a realm willing to govern wholly by his ideals, and yet, in this long passage across states and borders, his words found footing in the hearts of those who walked with him. Each rejection, each near-fatal trial, only deepened the bonds between teacher and disciples, and refined the meaning of his message. Under lantern light in distant inns, beside fires under desolate skies, and on cool riverbanks at dawn, Confucius taught not just doctrine, but the quiet dignity of perseverance. It was here, in the long darkness between hope and fulfillment, that the man who had sought to change the world through politics began to shape something far more enduring. A tradition of moral steadiness that no throne could ever command.
Chapter 9. Teaching Without a Kingdom. Convicted. For years, searching for a ruler who might embrace his vision of virtuous governance. But at the end of those journeys, he returned to his role as a teacher, carrying no title, no lands, and no political domain of his own. And yet, in this seeming loss, something remarkable began to take form. A way of influencing the world not through power, but through the shaping of minds and hearts. The world he lived in was fractured, unpredictable, and ruled by force. Confucius chose a different path, one that would ultimately leave a deeper mark on civilization. Confucius never commanded an army nor ruled a city, but he governed the minds of his followers through conversation, reflection, and moral example. Instead of issuing decrees, he engaged in dialogue. Instead of imposing doctrine, he guided his students to think, question, and discover truth for themselves. His teaching was not about memorizing rules, but about nurturing character. In his dialogues, recorded later by disciples in the Analects, he emphasized that education should be interactive, tailored to the individual, and rooted in moral understanding rather than rote repetition. A teacher, he once said, could point out a corner of a square, yet it was up to the student to complete the rest. The teacher illuminated, but the student had to walk the path. Confucius's approach was both humble and profound. He did not claim to have answers to all questions, but he helped others cultivate their own capacity for judgment. His classroom was a place where inquiry was welcomed and sincerity was prized above all. He taught poetry, history, music, and the rites, but always with a glance toward moral refinement, the art of becoming a better human being. Through these conversations,
his students were encouraged not merely to learn what was right, but why it was right. Among the central concepts he shared was the idea of the junzi. In Confucius's time, the term originally meant son of a ruler or gentleman of noble birth, but through his teaching, it came to signify something far more meaningful. A person of moral worth and cultivated character, one whose virtues outshone mere status. The junzi was not defined by lineage or power, but by ren, benevolence, and li, proper conduct. To be a junzi was to embody the ideal of a dignified, compassionate, and thoughtful person, whose example invited others toward virtue. Confucius did not stop at theory. He lived what he taught. Even as he aged, worn by the passage of decades and the disappointments of failed political reform, he continued to meet with students and travelers, engaging their questions with patience and clarity. In these dialogues, his thought took shape, not as a rigid system, but as a living conversation about what it meant to be truly human. By choosing to teach without a kingdom, Confucius transformed education into a form of moral leadership. Without lands to claim or soldiers to command, he guided the minds of those who would carry his vision forward. And in that quiet transmission of wisdom, his influence began to reach far beyond the boundaries of any state, planting seeds that would one day blossom into a civilization shaped not by force, but by the reflection and practice of virtue.
Chapter 10. The Core Ideas. In the quiet aftermath of long days spent wandering from court to court and teaching from village to village, Confucius turned his attention to the heart of what he taught. Having no kingdom to rule, no army to command, and no throne to ascend, he focused instead on something far more subtle: the inner landscapes of human character and social harmony. In the gentle cadence of his lessons, 3 ideals emerged as pillars, not rigid dogmas, but guiding stars for a fractured world longing for peace and order. These were ren, humaneness; li, ritual propriety; and xiao, filial piety. Each a breath of moral intent woven into the fabric of everyday life. First and foremost was ren, often translated as benevolence, humaneness, or compassion. For Confucius, ren was the central virtue, the quiet heart that must beat within every human being before any society could find harmony. It was not abstract goodness, but the felt experience of empathy, caring for others as oneself, acting kindly without coercion, and treating fellow humans with dignity and respect. He spoke of ren in everyday terms, urging his listeners to internalize what is often called the silver rule. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself. This was not simply a rule to recite, but a guiding breath in all human interaction, familial, social, and political. If ren was the inner beat, then li was the outward rhythm. Li encompassed ritual, propriety, etiquette, and the behaviors that shaped social order. But for Confucius, li was not empty formality. It was a living structure through which ren could be expressed. Rituals, from ancestor worship to formal ceremonies, from respect shown at the family table to the gestures of greeting and farewell, gave shape to what humaneness feels like in practice. When a person bows with sincere respect or offers hospitality without pretense, li becomes the language of social harmony. In this sense, ritual was neither mechanical nor decorative. It was the ground in which character could be cultivated and mutual respect sustained. Then there was xiao, or filial piety, a principle Confucius regarded as the root of all moral behavior. In a world where vast political structures so often failed, he turned to the family as the smallest unit of society. To honor one's parents and elders, to care for them in life and remember them after death, was not merely a domestic duty. It was the first lesson in reverence, responsibility, and love. Filial piety nurtured small acts of kindness that echoed outward, forming the basis of loyalty, trust, and societal stability. A society that could maintain reverence within the family stood a much better chance of cultivating respect in the wider world. Together, Ren, Li, and Xiao formed a gentle yet steady framework of moral life. Empathy that expands beyond self, structured conduct that maintains communal bonds, and deep respect rooted in the family circle. Confucius neither commanded armies nor decreed laws. Instead, he breathed life into these concepts, allowing them to grow organically in the hearts of those who listened. In the dialogues preserved later by his disciples, what we know today as the Analects, these ideas appear not as abstract doctrines, but as gentle reminders, shared in conversations, stories, and reflections by a teacher whose aim was to guide rather than impose. In the softness of night, as the wind whispered through the pines and lanterns flickered in distant courtyards, Confucius spoke of humaneness like a slow, measured breath. He spoke of ritual like the quiet rhythm that orders a life. And he spoke of filial piety as the first moral horizon one learns before moving outward into the vast, unpredictable world. And so, through ideas as soft and enduring as twilight itself, he began to shape not just thoughts, but the very way people lived with one another. Chapter 11. A Gentle Return Home. After years spent wandering the fractured lands of ancient China, Confucius quietly returned to his homeland of Lu in his late 60s. No longer a restless seeker of political change, but a seasoned teacher guided by decades of reflection and experience. He had walked through courts that would not heed him, stayed in states preoccupied with ambition, and witnessed the limits of moral persuasion within the realm of power. Yet homecoming did not bring disappointment. It brought peace, purpose, and a new kind of influence that would ripple far beyond the borders of his small state. According to traditional accounts, he returned around 484 BCE, welcomed by old friends and disciples at the urging of Lu's chief minister. In Lu, Confucius no longer pursued formal office, nor sought bureaucratic authority. The long years of political struggle had taught him that the path of moral reform was seldom conquered by decree. Instead, he embraced the role that had always given him the deepest satisfaction: teacher, mentor, and custodian of ancient wisdom. The elders and officials of Lu recognized his wisdom, often consulting him on matters of governance and justice, less as a ruler and more as a respected elder whose insight carried the weight of long experience. At a time when the social and political order remained unstable, Confucius turned his attention to the texts and traditions of the past. He was deeply devoted to the study and transmission of ancient literature and ceremony, believing that these treasures of human thought held the keys to individual cultivation and social harmony. Over the remaining years of his life, he and his disciples engaged in careful study and editorial work on the revered classics, including the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, and the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of events in Lu itself. These texts, treasured by later generations as part of what came to be known as the Five Classics,
were shaped in part through his dedication to preserving the old wisdom. At the same time, Confucius continued to teach large gatherings of students. Some records say he taught thousands of pupils, with dozens reaching mastery in the traditional arts and moral training. Rather than dictate doctrine, he engaged them in dialogue and shared inquiry, fostering minds capable of moral reflection and a deep appreciation for the wisdom of antiquity. Though aged and bearing the losses of time, including the deaths of his son and some closest disciples, Confucius found in these final years a gentle fulfillment. His ambitions for political reform gave way to the quieter mission of education and preservation. In the soft twilight of his life, among scrolls, students, and the rhythms of teaching and learning, he embodied the very virtues he had long sought to cultivate in others. And so he lived out his final days, not as a failed politician, but as a living bridge between the past and the future. A teacher whose influence would slowly spread outward through centuries of thoughtful minds and reflective hearts. Chapter 12. Editing the Past. As Confucius settled into his later years back in his homeland of Lu, his voice remained calm, but his mind reached ever deeper into the rich legacy of the past. He knew that the lessons of antiquity, the songs, speeches, rituals, and chronicles of earlier times, held the seeds of moral life for his uncertain present. And so, while he no longer wielded political power or carried a title, he took up a task of quiet yet profound influence: the careful preservation and shaping of the ancient texts that would come to define a civilization's memory. In the cultural world of Zhou, China, a group of revered writings had already taken form long before Confucius's birth. These included the Book of Changes, Yi Jing, the Book of History, Shu Jing, the Book of Poetry, Shi Jing, the Record of Rites, Li Ji, and the Spring and Autumn Annals, Chun Tu. Together, they would later be known as the Five Classics, a corpus of ancient thought, ritual practice, and historical record that shaped education, government, and ethical life across East Asia for more than 2 millennia. Confucius did not invent these texts. Most were already ancient by his day, and many had circulated in differing versions across the states. But he studied them tirelessly, selected passages that conveyed moral depth, and helped transmit them as core curriculum for his students. In traditions that grew after his death, he and his followers were credited with editing or shaping these works in ways that highlighted ethical meaning and human purpose. In particular, the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of events in Lu, was traditionally held to be the moral lens through which Confucius viewed history itself, assigning praise and blame in ways that taught ethical judgment as much as historical fact. Later generations would recall that Confucius approached these texts not as a scribe merely copying words, but as a guardian of cultural memory. He believed that the wisdom of earlier ages, properly understood and preserved, could teach harmony where there was conflict, and moral clarity where there had been only chaos. Through careful interpretation and teaching, he helped establish standards that united fragmented states in a shared vision of human conduct and social order. Much later, long after Confucius himself had passed from the world, scholars like Kong Yingda in the Tang dynasty would compile official commentaries and interpretations of the classics, reinforcing the text's authority and ensuring their place at the heart of imperial education for centuries. But in the quiet courtyards of Lu, in the gentle cadence of conversation between teacher and student, Confucius's contribution was more organic than institutional. He did not simply preserve the past, he shaped the way people looked back upon it, nudging memory gently toward reflection and moral discernment.
In this work of editing, he helped his own age speak with the voice of ages past, and lent his own voice to the chorus of tradition that would echo long into the future. Chapter 13. The Final Years. As Confucius entered his 70s, the pace of his life grew gentler, but his heart bore the weight of experiences far heavier than his years. After decades spent teaching, traveling, and preserving the wisdom of ancient China, his final years in his native state of Lu were marked not by political struggle, but by personal sorrow and quiet reflection. Though he had returned home with many disciples and admirers around him, life soon reminded him that even the greatest teachers are not immune to loss. One by one, those closest to him passed away. His own only son died during these final years, a blow that weighed deeply on a father who had long devoted his life to education and moral cultivation. At the same time, Confucius suffered the death of cherished students, including his favorite disciple, Yan Hui, whose gentle character and intellectual promise had once inspired Confucius more than almost any other. To Confucius, teaching was not an abstract vocation, but a deeply human connection, one that extended far beyond lessons on ritual, ethics, and propriety to touch the very heart of community and affection. The passing of those he loved revealed another dimension of his life's work, the capacity to feel deeply, to grieve fully, and to honor those bonds as part of what it meant to be human. In the quiet chambers of twilight, he mourned not merely as a teacher losing students, but as a father losing a son, and a mentor seeing the light of promising minds fade too soon. Yet even in grief, Confucius maintained a reflective calm. He understood that loss was part of the human condition, and that virtue was not merely to be taught, but to be lived through pain and resilience. He continued to speak with his remaining disciples, sharing memories and wisdom over simple evening meals and in gardens touched by the chill of dusk. In these moments, his teachings became less about instruction and more about presence, the abiding quality of shared life between teacher and student. Then, in the year 479 BCE, at the age of 73, Confucius passed away. There are no detailed records of his final hours, but his death was not sudden violence, but the natural closing of a long, reflective life. A life spent in pursuit of moral clarity and human connection. His body was laid to rest on the banks of the Shishui River, north of Chufu, the city of his birth, and the place where his journey had begun so many decades before. In the quiet hush of mourning that followed, his disciples remembered him not as a failed politician, but as a teacher whose influence outlived his grief and would continue to echo through the centuries. In that twilight moment between life and legend, Confucius's final lesson was not in grand proclamation, but in the quiet dignity of a life lived with unwavering moral depth. Chapter 14. Forgotten. At first, when Confucius breathed his last in 479 BCE, the world did not pause to herald the passing of a new empire. There were no grand monuments built in his honor, no immediate decree to enshrine his name in every hall of government. In those first years after his death, there was no great dynasty proclaiming Confucius as its spiritual founder. Only a handful of mourners who remembered his voice and the quiet cadence of his conversations. Even the world of ideas that he had devoted his life to shaping remained fragmented, caught between competing schools of thought. In the years immediately following his death, Confucius's influence did not radiate outward in triumphant waves. Instead,
it lingered quietly among those who had known him, his students and friends who felt his absence keenly and feared that the wisdom he had shared might fade with them. These men, deeply devoted to their teacher, began a humble yet decisive task. They recorded their memories of Confucius's words and dialogues, preserving the texture of his teaching as faithfully as they could. Over time, these scattered notes and recollections were gathered into a work that would later be known as the Analects. The Analects is not a single, unified text born at a single moment, but rather a collection of conversations, reflections, and fragments, an organic tapestry woven from the recollections of those closest to him. Traditionally, Confucius's first and second generation disciples are credited with initiating this project soon after his death, recording his sayings and the questions his students asked him. Over the following centuries, generations of followers edited, organized, and preserved these records through times of turmoil and renewal. For a period, Confucian thought did not dominate Chinese intellectual life. Other philosophical traditions, legalism, Taoism, and later Moism, competed for influence during the Warring States period. In this intellectual ferment, Confucian ideas were heard, debated, and sometimes dismissed, but they were never wholly lost, because the memory of Confucius lived on in the minds of those who continued to teach his way. Slowly, quietly, his teachings began to spread beyond the circle of his immediate disciples. As students taught students, and the Analects was copied and shared, Confucius's voice found new ears. What had begun as private recollection became the seed of a tradition, one that would eventually root itself deeply in the cultural and intellectual life of China and, in time, far beyond. In the hush of those early years after his passing, there was no empire built in his name, only the whispered memory of his words, recorded by those who knew him best. And from this quiet beginning would grow a legacy that would shape civilizations for centuries to come.
Chapter 15. When Emperors Needed a Teacher. Long after Confucius's gentle voice fell silent across the courtyards of Lu, and long after the teachers and disciples who once walked with him passed into memory, something extraordinary began to unfold in the heart of another dynasty. 2 centuries after his death, China was no longer fragmented into warring states. A new era had begun, the Han dynasty, which would rule for more than 400 years and become one of the longest-lasting imperial dynasties in Chinese history. In this new world of consolidated empire and central authority, the teachings of a man who never held a kingdom slowly found their place, not through force, but through enduring relevance. During the early years of the Han, rulers experimented with different ideas about how to govern. But it was under Emperor Wu of Han, who reigned in the 2nd century BCE, that a remarkable decision was made. Confucianism was adopted as the official state ideology. The Han court chose to elevate the ancient wisdom compiled and transmitted by Confucius and his followers, emphasizing moral cultivation, social harmony, and ethical leadership as foundations for imperial governance. This declaration did more than honor a long-dead teacher. It reshaped the very structure of how officials were selected and how the state itself understood moral order. One of the most enduring legacies of this choice was the establishment of the Imperial University and the emphasis on scholar officials trained in the Confucian classics. The 5 classics and the later 4 books, texts associated with Confucius and his earliest followers, became central to the education of bureaucrats and ministers. Study of these works was seen not as abstract philosophy, but as essential preparation for those entrusted with governing the empire, mediating disputes, advising rulers, and maintaining harmony across a vast and diverse land. Confucius himself, who had never ruled a province or commanded an army, now came to be revered as the teacher of all under heaven, a sage whose moral insight was more enduring than any court decree. His name and teachings were invoked in temples, classrooms, and the examinations that would determine official careers for more than 2 millennia. By embracing Confucian ethics, the Han dynasty not only promoted social stability, but also affirmed the timeless belief that good governance begins with the moral cultivation of leaders. In this subtle but profound transition, from wandering teacher to imperial advisor in spirit, Confucius's influence was no longer confined to the scattered students who once followed him. It now reached every corner of an empire, shaping how people thought about virtue, family, society, and the responsibilities of those in power.
And so, with the gentle authority of long-remembered words and quiet wisdom, Confucius's legacy truly became the heartbeat of a civilization, far beyond the humble rooms where he once taught, guiding not just individuals, but an entire empire's understanding of what it meant to live with moral purpose. Epilogue. The man who never ruled, yet reigned forever. Confucius never marched an army into battle, never crowned himself king, and never sat upon a throne commanding lands and subjects by decree. In his lifetime, he failed to bend the powerful to his vision of virtuous rule, and left this world without an empire built in his name. And yet, over the centuries that followed, he achieved something far rarer and more enduring. He conquered time itself, shaping the inner life of entire civilizations long after his own era faded from view. When later generations looked back across the rolling ages of dynasties and kingdoms, they saw in Confucius's teachings not merely antiquated sayings, but a foundation for stable society, moral education, and ethical thinking. His philosophy, built on the centered practice of compassion, ritual propriety, and filial reverence, grew into a framework that guided both rulers and ordinary people through centuries of change. Confucianism became the social code of China, deeply woven into the moral fabric of government, family, and civic life. Its influence expanded beyond China's borders to the wider cultural world of East Asia, the Sinosphere, including Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, where shared traditions of education, hierarchy, and familial respect took root. In China, Confucian ideas helped shape imperial governance and educational systems for over 2 millennia, from early adoption under the Han dynasty to later civil service examinations that tested aspirants on the classics associated with Confucius. In Korea, Confucianism traveled across centuries, becoming deeply embedded in social values and institutions. It influenced moral conduct, family relations, and political philosophies, and continued through periods such as the Joseon dynasty, where Confucian scholars became central to governance. Across the sea, Japan absorbed Confucian thought through a long process of cultural exchange, adapting its emphasis on duty, harmony, and ethical conduct into local frameworks of society and education. And in Vietnam, Confucian values were introduced both through historic contact with China and through the long development of indigenous systems of governance and learning. In each of these regions, Confucian principles,
though transformed by local history and tradition, continued to shape how people thought about virtue, duty, leadership, and the relationships that bind individuals to family and society. Remarkably, a teacher who walked the roads of ancient China with no kingdom to call his own became the teacher of all under heaven in the minds of later generations. His influence endured not because he wielded force, but because his ideas resonated across centuries and cultures, a testament to the quiet but persistent power of ethical thought. He taught that true leadership springs not from command, but from moral example, not from fear, but from wisdom and humanity. And because of this, even in centuries of war, reform, and revolution, Confucian values remained deeply imprinted on the institutions and moral imaginations of societies far beyond his place of birth. As we lie down under tonight's sky, let us reflect on this strange and gentle victory. How a teacher with no armies came to guide countless lives through shared ideas. How a humble voice across vast centuries spoke louder than empires themselves. Empires rise and fall, but the quiet voice of a teacher can last forever.
If you enjoyed this series and want more stories from history told in a calm, documentary style, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment about what period you'd like next, and hit the like button so we can continue bringing these narratives to your evening routine.